Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we ride deep into the strange and unexplained corners of Red Dead Redemption 2's frontier. The lights that hover where they shouldn't. The doors that open onto things no honest traveler should find. And the quiet, unsolved encounters that have lingered with players long after the credits rolled. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. A stranger in 3 territories. Somewhere in the marshy stretch of Bayou Edge, across the slow brown water of the Kamassa River in Lemoyne, there sits an abandoned shack that most players never think to visit twice. The first time you find it, there is nothing inside but dust, a few crates, and an old hat resting on a chair. There is a mirror on one wall and a painting propped against another, the painting unfinished. Its subject only half rendered in oil. Nothing about the shack announces itself as important. It looks like every other forgotten homestead scattered across the map, the kind of place a hunter might pass without a second glance. But if you leave, and if you keep playing, and if you eventually reach full completion of the game, something changes. Return to that same shack, and the painting is finished now. A man in a suit and top hat stares out from the canvas, his mustache neatly groomed, his expression unreadable. And if you look into the mirror on the wall for a single unsettling moment, he is standing behind you. There is something worth noting about the geography surrounding that shack before we go any further. Bayou Edge sits far from any well-traveled road, reachable only by picking a careful path along the Kamassa River's edge, through cypress stands and past the kind of standing water that seems to swallow sound the moment you enter it. Most players find the shack purely by accident, chasing a stray icon on the map or simply exploring, rather than through any quest marker guiding them there directly. And that accidental quality shapes the entire encounter. You are not meant to find this place. You are meant to stumble onto it, the way you might stumble onto something in the real world you were never supposed to see. And that sense of trespass lingers over every visit, whether or not the painting inside has finished itself yet. This is the strange man, and his presence in Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the quietest, most unnerving threads the game leaves dangling. He does not appear in cutscenes. He does not give quests. He exists almost entirely as implication, a shadow cast backward from the original Red Dead Redemption, where he was a fully realized character who intercepted John Marston at several points across the map, always knowing more about John's past than a stranger should. In that first game, the strange man tested John's morality through small vignettes, appearing and disappearing without explanation, speaking in riddles about sin and redemption. When John finally lost his patience and fired a gun directly at him, the bullets did nothing. The strange man simply turned and walked away. John, furious and frightened, shouted after him, "Damn you!" The strange man's reply was calm, almost fond. Many have. Nobody knows, even now, what he actually is. Players and researchers alike have spent years turning the character over in their hands, trying to find the seam where fiction meets explanation. Some read him as death itself, walking among the living to observe how they meet their end. Others believe he is a biblical figure, an angel or a demon or something in between, present at John's lowest and most defining moments, purely to bear witness. There is a detail that fuels the theistic reading further. Internally, within the game's own files, the strange man's character model in the original Red Dead Redemption is referred to simply as Mystery Man. while his recorded dialogue is filed under the name Mysterious_Stranger01. In Red Dead Redemption 2, his model carries an even more pointed internal name, CS_Mysterious Stranger, a title that many believe is a direct nod to Mark Twain's unfinished novella, The Mysterious Stranger, in which a being calling himself Satan wanders a small European village, calmly needling the townsfolk about the absurdity and hypocrisy of human morality. Whether Rockstar intended a literal connection or simply borrowed the tone, the echo feels deliberate. Both figures share the same detached, almost affectionate cruelty, watching human beings struggle with choices that mean nothing to a being who has already seen how the story ends. What makes his return in the prequel so effective is how little he actually does. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the strange man's cabin in Bayou is the only trace of him that exists during Arthur Morgan's story. There is no cutscene of him walking the roads of Lemoyne. There is no dialogue exchange, no quest marker guiding you toward him. He is present only through absence, through the objects he has left behind, through a shack that seems to exist purely so that dedicated players will eventually notice the painting has changed. This is in itself worth sitting with for a moment. Rockstar built an entire hidden character arc around a piece of environmental storytelling that the overwhelming majority of players will never see, tied to full completion of a game that already takes well over 100 hours to finish, even without hunting down every collectible. The shack rewards patience and returns almost nothing tangible for it. No trophy explains what you have found. No journal entry spells it out. You are simply left standing in a dim room, looking into a mirror, watching a figure who should not be there vanish the instant you turn around. Those encounters in the original game varied in tone, and the actual details are worth recalling here for anyone unfamiliar with them, because they establish exactly the kind of unsettling pattern Red Dead Redemption 2 later inherits, without ever repeating outright. In their first meeting, the strange man tells John, cryptically, that he already knows him, then sends him to Thieves' Landing to intervene, or decline to intervene, in a friend's decision to be unfaithful to his wife, quietly grading John's choice without ever explaining why a stranger's opinion on the matter should carry any weight at all. Their second meeting takes place near a chapel in Mexico, where the strange man presents John with a nun collecting donations and leaves him to choose between charity and theft. Their third and final meeting happens outside Beecher's Hope, at the exact spot where John will eventually be buried, though neither character knows that yet. The strange man calls the location a fine spot, refuses to give his name no matter how John presses him, and when John finally loses his temper and fires 3 shots at point-blank range, the bullets accomplish nothing. The strange man simply turns and walks away, while John stares at his own gun in disbelief. Each encounter reads less like a quest and more like a visitation, something closer to a memento mori delivered in person. And taken together, they build a portrait of a being who exists specifically at the margins of morality and mortality, testing John's choices without ever revealing why those choices matter to him. That pattern of appearing at the edges of death carries forward into the smaller details tucked inside his Red Dead Redemption 2 cabin as well, particularly the poem referencing Jimmy Brooks. Jimmy is a young man Arthur can choose to either kill or spare during an earlier, entirely separate story mission, and the wording of the poem inside the strange man's shack shifts depending on which outcome the player chose. Mourning Jimmy if he died, or speaking of him with something closer to hope if he survived. It's a small piece of evidence suggesting the strange man isn't simply watching Arthur's own moral choices in the abstract, the way the shifting paintings imply, but tracking specific individual lives and deaths scattered throughout this world, keeping some kind of private ledger of who lived and who didn't, for reasons that remain, as with everything else about him, entirely his own. Bayou Edge sits in the humid lowlands of Lemoyne, tangled with cypress trees and slow water, not far from the geography that inspired the American South's own long tradition of ghost stories and folk religion. It is worth remembering that the state Lemoyne is built from a blend of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia, a region historically layered with tales of wandering spirits, crossroads deals, and men who are not quite men. Placing the strange man's cabin here, rather than somewhere colder and more austere like the Grizzlies, feels intentional. This is haunted country by cultural tradition, long before Rockstar ever drew a map of it. There is another layer to the mystery that connects the strange man to Herbert Moon, the eccentric, deeply paranoid general store owner in Armadillo. Herbert keeps a portrait behind his counter, and if players look closely, the man in that portrait bears an unmistakable resemblance to the strange man himself. In the original Red Dead Redemption's epilogue, John Marston visits that same general store years later and remarks, almost in passing, that the man in the portrait looks familiar to him, even though John has not yet met the strange man at that point in the timeline. It is a small continuity thread, easy to miss, but it suggests that the strange man's presence in this world stretches back further than either game acknowledges outright, that he has been watching this particular stretch of frontier for longer than any single character's lifetime could explain. What deepens the unease is the detail about the paintings inside the shack. Beyond the central portrait of the strange man himself, additional artwork inside the cabin actually shifts depending on Arthur's honor level. Play with high honor, treating strangers with kindness and choosing mercy when the game offers it, and the paintings scattered through the shack depict eagles and bucks, animals traditionally associated with nobility and strength. Play with low honor, leaning into greed and cruelty, and those same paintings transform into vultures and coyotes, scavengers that circle the dying and pick at what's left behind. The implication is heavy. Somehow, somewhere, this shack is watching you too. It is registering the choices you make across dozens of hours of gameplay and reflecting them back at you in imagery, long before you ever set foot inside to see it. There is even a poem inside the cabin concerning the fate of Jimmy Brooks, whose own life or death within the story changes depending on choices Arthur makes far earlier in the game, and that poem's wording shifts to match the outcome you chose. Taken together, these details suggest something more unsettling than a simple Easter egg. The strange man's cabin does not merely reference Arthur's journey. It seems to know it, to track it, to adjust itself around the shape of the choices a player has made without ever explaining how or why. Some players have theorized that the strange man exists outside the normal flow of time within this world, a being who observes multiple timelines simultaneously, present at both John's story and Arthur's story, because to him they are happening at once. Others believe more simply that he represents Rockstar's own commentary on morality systems, a wink toward the mechanics beneath the story, made flesh and given a top hat and a mustache, so that players might feel just for a moment that something behind the curtain of the game is looking directly back at them. Within the games themselves, no resolution is ever offered, no cutscene, no journal entry, no patch note ever states plainly what the strange man is. For years, the closest anyone came to an official answer was an old magazine interview in which Rockstar, asked directly whether the top-hatted figure represented God or Satan, said only that they couldn't say either way. That changed more recently when Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser gave an interview reflecting on the character's origins, describing him as something closer to a manifestation of a player's own shadow, their karma even, in Houser's own word, the devil, and explaining that the vignettes were invented partly out of necessity, since a game about a man riding a horse across an empty desert needed something to make the silence feel less mundane. Even that explanation, offered well after both games had already shipped, stopped short of settling the matter entirely. Houser himself framed the character's knowledge as ambiguous, wondering aloud in the same interview whether the strange man's insight into a person's conscience is something unique to John and Arthur, or a power he holds over everyone he happens to cross paths with. So even the person who invented him leaves the door open. He remains, by design and by belated authorial admission alike, exactly what his name suggests: a stranger, glimpsed only in reflection, present only in absence, a figure who has apparently followed the Marston bloodline and the ghosts of the Van der Linde gang across 2 games and at least 2 decades of in-world time, without the game itself ever once explaining why. There's a small, chilling detail buried in how Rockstar's own systems label this location, one that most players never notice because it requires actively using a feature few people bother with. Red Dead Redemption 2 allows players to take in-game photographs and upload them through Rockstar's companion service, the Social Club, which automatically tags each screenshot with a description of where it was taken. Snap a photo anywhere near the strange man's cabin in Bayou Edge, and the location tag that gets generated doesn't read anything like abandoned shack or swamp dwelling. It reads, simply and without explanation, serial killer. Nobody has ever offered an official reason why Rockstar's own back-end systems would classify this specific, otherwise unremarkable location using that exact phrase. And the discovery has only deepened the sense that whatever this cabin represents, the developers themselves regarded it as something considerably darker than a simple Easter egg. To understand why the character carries this weight at all, it helps to remember what he actually did in the original Red Dead Redemption, a game set 4 years after the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, and following John Marston, rather than Arthur Morgan. In that earlier story, the strange man appeared to John at several unconnected points scattered across the map, always in the aftermath of violence or moral compromise, always speaking as though he already understood exactly what John had just done, and exactly what it had cost him. He never explained how he knew. He simply appeared, delivered some quiet, unsettling observation about sin, mortality, or the weight of a violent life, and vanished again before John could press him for real answers. Those encounters gave the character in the original game a fully formed presence that Red Dead Redemption 2 deliberately withholds, choosing instead to reduce him to implication and absence, a shadow of the figure John would eventually meet, already watching, already waiting, years before their paths were ever meant to cross. Full completion in Red Dead Redemption 2 requires finishing every main story mission, every stranger side quest, hunting down dozens of collectibles scattered across an enormous map, and generally investing well over 100 hours into Arthur's story before the game even considers your save file complete. Only then does the painting inside that cabin finish itself. Only then does the mirror show you something it wasn't showing you before. That means the vast majority of people who have played this game, even those who loved it, even those who finished the main story and felt satisfied walking away will never see this moment at all. It exists purely for the small, dedicated fraction of players willing to chase full completion for its own sake. A private reward tucked so deep into the game's structure that it functions almost like a secret whispered only to those patient enough to have earned it. There's something worth sitting with in that choice. Most games reward full completion with a trophy, a title card, a satisfying flourish of music and congratulations. Red Dead Redemption 2 rewards it, in this one specific case, with dread. With a man who shouldn't be standing behind you, gone the instant you turn to look. It's a strange kind of gift, offering discomfort in place of celebration. And it says something about how thoroughly Rockstar committed to building unease into every layer of this world, even the layers that exist purely for the most devoted, most patient corner of its audience. Perhaps that is the point. Some figures are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be encountered, briefly, in a dusty mirror in a swamp shack nobody thought to visit twice, and then left to wander back into whatever darkness produced them in the first place. Lights above Mount Shann, north of Strawberry, in the rugged high country of West Elizabeth's Big Valley region. Mount Shann rises above the tree line into cold, thin air. It is not the tallest peak on the map, but it may be the strangest, home to two of the most talked about unexplained phenomena in all of Red Dead Redemption 2, and the connective tissue between them is something that should not exist in a grounded story about outlaws and railroads and the closing of the American frontier. It is, by every reasonable account within the fiction, a spacecraft. The story begins not on the mountain itself, but in a small, decrepit shack near Emerald Ranch in New Hanover. Players who wander inside during daylight hours find a scene of quiet horror. Several skeletons scattered across the floor, the unmistakable remains of what looks like a mass suicide. Beside the bodies lies a letter, and the letter is worth reading in full, because its language sets the tone for everything that follows. It speaks of casting off corporal shells, so that a vessel might carry the group's spirits to what it calls the Promised Realm, a place they will inhabit until what the text calls the 2000th year, at which point they promise to return for the new chosen and worship once again at the peak of Mount Shann. The letter is signed, in effect, to a figure called Kukawaba, described as Voyager of Time and Galaxies. Players and researchers alike have searched exhaustively for any real-world reference this name might be drawing from. And as far as anyone has determined, it appears to be entirely invented for this game, a name with no root in any documented mythology, cult, or historical record. Whatever Kukawaba is meant to represent, it exists only within the borders of this fictional frontier. The language of the letter, invented name aside, echoes a very real and well-documented pattern in the history of American religious movements. One the developers were almost certainly drawing on, even if no single historical group matches it exactly. The language of casting off physical bodies to be carried away by a vessel toward salvation calls to mind the actual Heaven's Gate movement of the 1990s, whose members similarly framed their own mass suicide as a deliberate departure from earthly form rather than an ending, timed around a specific celestial event rather than a specific date on a calendar. The broader pattern: small, isolated communities convincing themselves that a promised transcendence awaits just beyond death, arriving on a schedule tied to the sky rather than to ordinary time, runs through more than a century of American fringe religious history, and setting this particular echo of it in the 1890s, decades before the real-world parallel most players will recognize, gives the fictional cult a strange, almost prophetic quality, as though this isolated corner of the frontier stumbled onto a belief structure that history would go on repeating long after these particular believers were gone. The letter contains a specific instruction, one so precise it almost dares the player to test it. It tells its followers to gather at the second hour under the half moon. Red Dead Redemption 2 runs on a genuine lunar cycle, and if a player returns to this same shack at 2 in the morning, timed to a night when the moon is at its half phase, the room fills with an eerie green light. Looking up through the broken, rotted ceiling, a small craft becomes visible hovering directly above the structure, glowing, hanging in the sky where nothing should be hanging. It remains there for roughly 2 hours, or until the player steps outside, at which point it vanishes as though it had never been there at all. The letter's final lines point toward a second location, and this is where Mount Shann itself enters the story. The text explicitly names the mountain as the place where the cult intended to worship again. And sure enough, at the mountain's highest peak, players who search carefully will find a circle of stones arranged in a way that feels deliberately unnatural, easy to walk right past if you are not looking for it. Standing near this stone circle between roughly 1 and 4 in the morning reveals a second craft, smaller than the one above the shack, visible hovering at a distance in the dark sky over the valley below. What makes this discovery even stranger is a piece of evidence found in a completely different part of the map. In the frozen reaches of the Grizzlies, players can find the bodies of 2 settlers who froze to death, and among their belongings is a panoramic map, hand-drawn and cryptic. That map leads, eventually, to a specific rock carving found on Mount Shann itself, one bearing 6 points radiating outward from a central mark. When compared against the locations where the 2 crafts have been sighted, some of those points appear to correspond. The remaining points on the drawing, however, have never been definitively matched to anything else discovered in the game world, which has led to a persistent, unresolved theory among the community that there may be additional sighting locations still waiting to be found, additional shacks or peaks or stone circles scattered somewhere across the map that nobody has yet connected to this same eerie thread. The shack itself deserves a moment of attention before moving further into the mystery it contains. Small, rotted, its roof caved in enough to let moonlight, and, apparently, something far stranger than moonlight pour through. It sits alone near Emerald Ranch, without any obvious reason for anyone to have built there in the first place. There's no water source nearby worth noting, no fertile ground, nothing that would have drawn ordinary settlers to stake a claim on that particular patch of New Hanover. Whoever built it seems to have chosen the location specifically for its isolation, close enough to civilization to gather occasional supplies, far enough removed that a group could conduct whatever rituals they believed necessary without prying eyes from Emerald Ranch, wandering over to ask questions. That kind of deliberate isolation tends to accompany doomsday belief throughout history, real and fictional alike. Communities pulling inward, putting distance between themselves and a world they've already decided has nothing left to offer them. There's a detail here that connects this mystery to another one entirely, and it's easy to miss unless you happen to be chasing both threads at once. One of the 10 rock carvings tied to a completely separate stranger mission, the search for a collector named Francis Sinclair, whose own story we'll return to later, sits close to Mount Shann's peak as well, near the very same summit where the smaller of the 2 crafts can be observed. It's worth being careful here, because the game never explicitly states that these 2 mysteries are connected, and the carving itself depicts imagery tied to Sinclair's own strange arc, rather than anything overtly extraterrestrial. Still, the sheer coincidence of two of the game's most talked about unsolved threads sharing the exact same remote mountaintop feels deliberate in a way that's hard to dismiss entirely, and it has fueled no shortage of theories suggesting Mount Shann itself, rather than any single mystery tied to it, might be the true anchor point for whatever strangeness Rockstar wove into this corner of the map. Players climbing to the summit for one mystery often stumble onto evidence of the other without meaning to, and more than a few have wondered aloud whether that overlap was an accident of level design or something closer to an intentional wink. There's also a small, easily missed detail waiting for anyone who reaches the summit itself. Perched near the flat overlook, where the stone circle sits, an eagle can often be found resting at the cliff's edge, watching the valley below. It means nothing on its own, likely nothing more than ordinary wildlife placement, but after enough nighttime visits spent waiting for lights that may or may not appear, that solitary bird becomes something like a landmark of its own, the only other living presence keeping watch over the same lonely peak. It's worth pausing on just how deliberately constructed this whole mystery feels. This is not a single random object placed by a developer as a throwaway joke. It is a multi-location puzzle spanning at least 3 distinct sites across 2 different territories, requiring the player to notice a corpse-filled shack, read and correctly interpret a letter, understand a lunar cycle mechanic that most players never think twice about, climb one of the tallest and most remote peaks on the entire map, locate a stone circle that offers no marker or prompt, and then return at a very specific window of nighttime hours to witness the payoff. Rockstar has built entire hidden mysteries into their open worlds before, most famously the long-running speculation around Mount Chiliad in Grand Theft Auto 5, and the Mount Shann mystery in Red Dead Redemption 2 has, since the game's release, drawn exactly that kind of sustained, almost obsessive community attention, players combing every inch of the mountain, looking for some further clue, some final answer that ties the whole thing together into a satisfying bow. That answer has never come. What remains instead is a series of open questions that the game seems entirely comfortable leaving open. Did the cultists who wrote that letter actually succeed in whatever ritual they attempted? Did something answer their call, take their souls as promised, and simply leave the bodies behind as an afterthought? Or did they die believing in a promise that was never coming, poisoning themselves or each other in a shared delusion, with the lights above the mountain being nothing more than a cruel cosmic coincidence, arriving decades after the fact for reasons that have nothing to do with the people who once worshipped there? Some players lean toward reading the crafts as validation, proof that whatever these people believed was, in some fashion, real. Others find that reading almost more disturbing than the alternative, since it would mean something genuinely otherworldly. Noticed a group of desperate, grieving frontier settlers and either helped end their lives or simply didn't care enough to stop it. There is also the question of why aliens, if that is even the correct word for whatever these crafts represent, would appear at all in a game so committed to historical grounding. Extraterrestrial imagery is something of a running thread throughout Rockstar's other major franchise, appearing in various forms across multiple Grand Theft Auto titles, usually treated as a wink to the player. A moment of intentional tonal whiplash meant to remind you that the studio behind this meticulously researched frontier simulation is the same studio capable of deep, self-aware absurdity. Red Dead Redemption 2 folds that same impulse into its own world, without ever winking at the camera. There is no arcade minigame here, No joke NPC who talks about little green men. There is only a shack full of bodies, a letter written with total sincerity, and two lights in the sky that behave exactly the way the letter said they would. There is something particularly effective about how isolated Mount Shann feels, even by the standards of a game built almost entirely around isolation. Big Valley sits well off the main roads most players travel during the story's core missions, and Mount Shann itself towers above even that already remote stretch of West Elizabeth, cold and windswept, home to little beyond eagles, mountain goats, and the occasional stray hunter chasing a legendary pelt. Reaching the summit at all requires a slow, deliberate climb, picking a careful path along narrow switchbacks with a long drop waiting on either side. Doing that climb once in daylight already feels like an accomplishment. Doing it again at 1 or 2 in the morning in the dark, specifically to stare at an empty patch of sky and hope something appears, asks something different of a player entirely. It asks for faith, the same kind of faith in miniature that apparently drove an entire group of settlers to gather their belongings, write a letter to a being with an invented, unknowable name, and end their own lives in a rotting one-room shack, trusting that something was waiting on the other side to receive them. That parallel is worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire encounter. This isn't simply a fun, hidden light show, tucked into the game for observant players to stumble across. It is, structurally, an invitation to participate in the same act of faith that destroyed the people who came before you. You climb the mountain, you wait in the cold, you watch the sky, and something, eventually, appears exactly where a group of desperate, grieving people once believed it would. Whether that should feel like vindication or warning is left entirely for the player to decide standing alone at the summit, watching a small, impossible light hang silently over a valley that has already swallowed at least one group of true believers whole. Whatever the truth is, and it is entirely possible Rockstar never intended a definitive truth to exist at all, the effect on the player is the same. You climb down from that mountain having witnessed something the game refuses to explain, carrying only a journal sketch and a strange, lingering unease, the sense that somewhere above Big Valley, on certain nights, under a very particular moon, something is still keeping the appointment those settlers made more than a century ago, waiting patiently for chosen souls who may never come again. What walks the Bayou after dark? South of the mansions and cathedral spires of St. Denis, the land dissolves into something older and less hospitable. Bluewater Marsh and the wider Bayou NWA stretch out in a maze of standing water, cypress knees, and drooping moss, a landscape that swallows sound and light in equal measure. During the day, this swamp is simply dangerous in the ordinary sense, thick with alligators and biting insects. After dark, it becomes something else entirely, home to a faction the game refers to, in its own files, as the Nightfolk. They are unlike any of the other outlaw gangs scattered across the map. The O'Driscoll Boys and the Lemoyne Raiders operate more or less like traditional criminal organizations, armed with pistols and rifles, motivated by greed and grudges a player can understand. The Nightfolk operate by an entirely different logic. They fight almost exclusively with bows and crude melee weapons, and rather than robbing travelers of their money, they seem primarily interested in killing them, often in ways designed to be found and remembered by whoever comes next. Bodies, sometimes whole, sometimes reduced to disturbing fragments, are strung up from low branches or lashed to tree trunks throughout the marsh, left hanging in the fog like grim decorations. The Nightfolk themselves appear covered in dirt, or smeared with white paint, wearing tattered hand-stitched clothing that looks more primitive than anything else in the game's careful 19th century wardrobe. They move and communicate through clicks and hisses rather than speech, more animal than outlaw, and they are, notably, the only hostile faction in the entire game, with random encounters specifically built around trying to kill the player's horse rather than the player. Finding them requires deliberately putting yourself at risk. Head into Bluewater Marsh sometime between 10 at night and 5 in the morning. And if you linger long enough in the fog and the standing water, you may be ambushed, dragged suddenly into an encounter that feels less like a scripted mission and more like something the swamp itself decided to do to you. Survive that first encounter, and the game opens a stranger mission called A Fine Night for It, in which an elderly figure known only as Old Cajun approaches Arthur after sunset and explains, in halting, frightened language, that the night folk have been trespassing on land he considers his. Land, he clearly believes, belonged to his family before something drove them out into the swamp to become whatever they are now. Completing the mission means riding back out into the marsh at his side and fighting off a fresh wave of night folk attackers defending that same disputed ground. And once the immediate threat is cleared, Old Cajun rewards Arthur for the help and effectively vanishes from the story, his own fate afterward left just as unresolved as everything else this stretch of swamp seems to specialize in. Whether he actually manages to hold that reclaimed patch of land, or whether the night folk simply return once Arthur has moved on to other business elsewhere on the map, is never shown or mentioned again. Old Cajun himself is a strange, half-glimpsed figure appearing only after dark, offering just enough backstory to make the whole situation feel personal rather than random, without ever offering enough to satisfy real curiosity about who he actually is or how long he's been fighting this particular losing battle against the swamp, closing in around whatever he still calls his home. That is essentially all the direct explanation the game ever gives. There is no cutscene detailing the night folk's origin. There is no journal entry from Arthur speculating about who they used to be. What exists instead is atmosphere, environmental clues, and a persistent, unresolved sense that these are not simply bandits who chose violence as a profession, but something closer to what horror fiction would call feral, people who've been out in this swamp so long that whatever civilization once shaped them has been stripped away entirely, replaced by something instinctive and communal and deeply hostile to outsiders. The similarity to films like Bone Tomahawk, in which a tribe of cave-dwelling cannibals cover themselves in mud and hunt with primitive brutality, has been noted repeatedly by players and critics alike, and the resemblance does not feel accidental. Rockstar clearly drew on that particular strain of American backwoods horror when building this faction, folding it seamlessly into a swamp, already thick with its own real-world folklore. There is also the question of what, precisely, the night folk worship, because the game strongly implies they worship something. Their apparent home settlement, a cluster of huts and tents known as Lakay, only fully reveals its darker features in Red Dead Online, where a burning torch mounted atop a heap of human skulls stands at the center of camp, surrounded by primitive shelters. In the single-player story, this same location offers a quieter but still unmistakable version of the same imagery, with wooden entrance posts carved and decorated with skulls marking the way in. Elsewhere in the swamp, at a location fittingly named Butcher's Creek, players can find a pentagram scratched or painted into the ground, evidence of some kind of ritual practice that the game never bothers to attribute definitively to any single group. It could belong to the Night Folk. It could belong to one of the region's other violent factions, the Murfree Brood up in Roanoke Ridge, or the Skinner brothers out in Tall Trees, both of whom share more than a passing resemblance to the Night Folk in temperament and method. The game simply refuses to say, leaving players to draw their own uneasy conclusions from a landscape littered with symbols and never once tied together into a coherent story. This ambiguity has become, in its own way, one of the most actively debated unsolved mysteries the community continues to argue over. When the question of the Night Folk's true identity resurfaces periodically online, one theory in particular tends to rise above the others and earn the most agreement. Some players have proposed that the Night Folk are, in fact, descended from or connected to the population of St. Denis itself, perhaps outcasts, perhaps the victims of some unspoken tragedy that pushed them out of the city and into the swamp generations ago, where isolation and hardship slowly reshaped them into something the good citizens of St. Denis would no longer recognize as neighbors, let alone as family. It is worth noting this remains community speculation rather than anything the game confirms outright, one reading among several that circulate whenever the subject comes up. But it is a reading that fits uncomfortably well with the broader shape of the story. St. Denis is, after all, a city the game repeatedly frames as glamorous on its surface and rotten underneath. Its wealth built on exploitation, its institutions quietly corrupt. A group of the city's own forgotten, driven into the bayou and left to become monsters in the dark, would be a fittingly bleak footnote to everything else the game has to say about that particular slice of the frontier. There is a practical dimension to the terror as well, one that separates the Night Folk from nearly every other hostile encounter scattered across the map. Most of Red Dead Redemption 2's outlaw gangs telegraph their presence clearly. Camps have watchmen. Bandits shout warnings before opening fire. Even ambushes along the road tend to follow a recognizable pattern that a careful player learns to anticipate after enough hours in the saddle. The Night Folk refuse that pattern entirely. They do not shout. They do not warn. Traps appear where no traps should be. Snares and tripwires strung low across game trails that a rider moving at any real speed has no realistic chance of spotting in time. Riding into Bluewater Marsh at night, even fully prepared, even expecting trouble, still carries a genuine element of surprise that few other regions of the map manage to replicate, because the swamp itself works in their favor. Fog and standing water and drooping moss conspiring to hide exactly the kind of movement a hunted animal would want hidden. There's also the matter of what happens to travelers who never make it out. The game never tracks or names individual victims, the way it does for figures like Agnes Dowd, but the sheer volume of remains scattered through the marsh, bodies and body parts alike, suggests a toll that has been accumulating for a long time, likely well before Arthur Morgan ever had reason to ride through this particular stretch of Lemoyne. Some of those remains belong to travelers, judging by scattered belongings nearby. Others appear to belong to lawmen, based on remnants of uniform found near a handful of the more grisly displays. If even the people paid to enforce order in this region have gone missing out here and never been recovered, it says something uncomfortable about how thoroughly the state has ceded this particular corner of its territory to whatever the swamp has become. There's a small but telling detail buried in one of the swamp's unrelated bounty hunting encounters that reinforces just how deeply Bayou NWA's reputation has seeped into every corner of this region's storytelling. A wanted man named Lindsay Wofford can be captured alive and marched through this same stretch of territory on the way to face justice in St. Denis, and if the player keeps him alive long enough to reach the police station, Arthur remarks, almost in passing, on how relieved he is that their journey through this particular stretch of country is finally coming to an end. It's a throwaway line, easy to miss entirely, but it confirms something the environmental storytelling has already been suggesting all along. Even hardened outlaws accustomed to violence treat passage through Bayou NWA as something to be endured rather than simply travelled. A stretch of road every local criminal and lawman alike seems to agree is better crossed quickly and left behind. The label the game's own files attach to this faction, voodoo-esque, is worth sitting with rather than passing over, because it places the night folk within a real and specific cultural tradition, rather than a generic swamp monster archetype invented purely for shock value. Louisiana voodoo, brought to the region by enslaved West Africans and later shaped by Haitian and French Catholic influence, is a genuine spiritual practice with its own history, symbolism, and community. One that popular fiction has spent well over a century distorting into shorthand for menace and superstition. Based on what the game actually shows rather than states outright, it appears Red Dead Redemption 2 leans into that same well-worn distortion, rather than engaging with the real religion in any specific way, borrowing surface signifiers like skulls, ritual sites, and painted bodies without grounding the night folk in anything resembling the tradition's actual beliefs or practices. Read this way. It's a choice worth noting for what it suggests about the limits of the game's otherwise unusually careful historical research, even as it succeeds, purely as horror, at making Bluewater Marsh one of the most effectively unsettling regions anywhere on the map. What can be said with certainty is only what the swamp itself shows you. The bodies in the trees, the skulls on the posts, the clicks and hisses in the fog. A gang that wants your horse dead as much as it wants you dead. And an old man's plea to clear people off land he insists is his. Land that the Marsh, and whatever now calls it home, seems entirely unwilling to give back. Whoever the night folk once were, they are by the time you meet them. No longer anything the rest of Lemoyne would claim as its own. And the swamp has kept their true story as tightly as it keeps everything else it swallows. The woman who waits in Bluewater Marsh. There is a second presence in Bluewater Marsh, one entirely separate from the night folk, though the two share the same fog and the same reputation for turning an ordinary night ride into something no player forgets. She does not attack. She does not chase. She simply appears drifting at the edge of visibility among the cypress trees, and if you are close enough and lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, Arthur will actually notice her and record the sighting in his journal without any prompting from the player at all. Her name, discovered only through careful attention to letters and documents scattered through the swamp, is Agnes Dowd, and her story is one of the quieter, sadder tragedies buried in this corner of the map. Piecing her history together requires patience, because the game never sits you down and tells it to you directly. What emerges instead, gathered from letters found tucked into the marsh's various structures, is the outline of a young woman who fell in love with a man who was already married. He accepted what she offered, took what he wanted from the relationship, and eventually returned to his wife, leaving Agnes behind with a child, and it seems very little support or sympathy from the world around her. The isolation, the shame a society of that era would have heaped onto an unmarried mother, and the sheer weight of being discarded by someone she loved appear to have broken something in her over time. the story that letters and implication build toward is a violent one, suggesting that Agnes, in the grip of whatever grief or madness had taken hold of her, ultimately killed her child, the man who wronged her and herself, an act so final and so total that the marsh itself seems to have absorbed the horror of it into its very geography. The letters that carry this story are scattered rather than gathered in one convenient place, which is itself part of why so few players ever piece the whole picture together on a single playthrough. One might turn up tucked inside a rotted structure deep in the marsh, easily mistaken for ordinary set dressing, rather than a genuine collectible worth reading closely. Another surfaces somewhere else entirely, connected only by careful cross-referencing after the fact. The game trusts players to do that work themselves, to treat a handful of yellowed, water-stained pages as evidence worth assembling into a timeline. And it offers no summary, no journal entry from Arthur drawing the threads together into a tidy conclusion once the reading is done. Whatever understanding a player walks away with, they built it themselves piece by piece, in exactly the same patient, uncertain way a person might actually reconstruct a decades-old local tragedy from nothing but scraps of paper and half-remembered rumor. Now she haunts the place where it happened, or at least, that is the only explanation the game seems to offer for what players see. She appears most reliably at night, a pale, indistinct figure moving among the trees, sometimes glimpsed only for a moment before the fog swallows her again. Unlike almost every other supernatural element in Red Dead Redemption 2, her appearance does not require a specific quest chain, a set of collected clues, or a particular time window tied to the lunar calendar. She is simply out there, part of the ambient possibility space of Bluewater Marsh after dark. One more reason, alongside the night folk and the alligators and the endless standing water. Why sensible travelers avoid this stretch of swamp once the sun goes down? What makes her particular haunting land so effectively is the restraint with which the game presents it. There is no jump scare built around her, no forced encounter, no boss fight waiting at the end of a quest marker. She exists purely as something you might catch out of the corner of your eye, easy to dismiss as a trick of the fog and the game's notoriously moody lighting, until you notice Arthur's own journal entry, confirming that he saw her too, that his own character registered the sighting as something real and worth recording rather than something to be explained away. That single detail, the fact that the protagonist himself treats the encounter as genuine rather than imagined, does more to sell the horror of it than any elaborate set piece could. There is also something particularly bleak about her fate when set against the wider pattern of women's stories scattered throughout Red Dead Redemption 2's world. Agnes Dowd is far from the only woman in this game whose tragedy stems from being loved conditionally, used, and then abandoned once she became inconvenient. The frontier the game depicts is, in many small and large ways, openly hostile to women who step outside the narrow roles society had carved out for them. And Agnes represents perhaps the most extreme, most permanently unresolved version of that pattern. She never gets a name mentioned in dialogue. She never gets a quest built around uncovering the full truth of what happened to her. She exists as fragments, as implication, as a figure glimpsed briefly in a swamp that has already swallowed so many other bodies and so many other secrets that one more lost woman barely registers as anything unusual to the world around her. It's worth noting too, how her story sits alongside the other strange presences that share this same patch of geography. Bluewater Marsh, in the space of a few square miles, contains a cult of feral, possibly cannibalistic outlaws, a ritual pentagram of uncertain origin, and now a grieving, murderous ghost, all layered on top of one another without any single thread connecting them explicitly. Some players have wondered, without any confirmation from the game itself, whether Agnes's story and the presence of the Night Folk might be more connected than they first appear, whether the same isolation and desperation that drove her to violence might echo something in whatever drove the Night Folk into the feral state the game finds them in. This remains speculation, unsupported by any direct evidence, but it speaks to how thoroughly the Marsh itself functions as a kind of thematic pressure cooker within the game's design. A place where grief and isolation and violence all seem to concentrate and curdle together into something the rest of the map simply doesn't produce in the same density. There's a broader cultural tradition worth understanding here, one that makes Agnes feel less like an isolated invention and more like a deliberate piece of regional storytelling. The American South, and Louisiana's Bayou country in particular, carries a long, well-documented folk tradition of what older residents once called haints, restless spirits tied to a specific place by tragedy, unable to leave the ground where their story ended. These figures rarely appear as vengeful or monstrous in the older tellings. More often, they're described exactly the way Agnes behaves here: sorrowful, wandering, glimpsed only briefly by travelers who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong hour. Placing a figure like her in this specific swamp, rather than anywhere else on the map, taps directly into that inherited regional folklore rather than inventing something from nothing. And it's part of why her presence lands as effectively as it does even without a single line of explanatory dialogue attached to it. There is something worth noting in how differently the game treats Agnes compared to nearly every other significant female character in Arthur's story. Sadie Adler gets an entire arc, a transformation from grieving widow to hardened gunslinger the player watches unfold across dozens of missions. Abigail Roberts, later Abigail Marston, gets a home, a wedding, an ending that at least gestures toward peace. Even minor characters like Molly O'Shea or Mary Beth Gaskell get named dialogue, personal histories, moments of vulnerability the player can choose to engage with or ignore. Agnes gets none of that. She gets fragments. A first name and a last name pieced together from letters half buried in a swamp. A tragedy implied rather than confirmed. A handful of seconds glimpsed through fog before she dissolves back into the trees. In a game this committed to giving even its smallest characters some flicker of interior life, her near-total silence feels less like an oversight and more like a deliberate choice, as though the swamp itself has decided that her story belongs to it now, and it isn't interested in sharing. Some players have found a strange kind of comfort in returning to the marsh specifically to look for her, treating the search almost like a small ritual of acknowledgement, a way of saying that her story, however fragmentary, was at least noticed by someone. Whether that impulse says more about the game's design or about the players drawn to it is worth wondering about on its own. Either way, she remains out there, waiting in the fog for anyone patient enough or unlucky enough to go looking. What lingers longest after an encounter with Agnes is not fear exactly, but something closer to sorrow. She does not want to hurt you. She does not chase, does not curse, does not demand anything of the living who happen to wander through her swamp. She simply exists, caught in an endless loop of whatever moment defined her final days, unable to leave the place where everything went wrong, visible only to those quiet enough or unlucky enough to be looking in the right direction on the right kind of foggy night. Long after you've moved on to other parts of the map, other stories, other strangers with their own quests and their own secrets. The marsh remains exactly as it was, and somewhere in it, Agnes Dowd is very likely still waiting. Dinner with the Aberdeens, north of the town of Pleasance, close to the border where Lemoyne gives way to New Hanover. A narrow dirt trail leads to a small, unremarkable ranch called Aberdeen Pig Farm. From a distance, it looks exactly like dozens of other small homesteads scattered across the map. A modest wooden house, a fenced animal pen, a scattering of outbuildings. There is one detail that should give a careful player pause almost immediately, though it is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. Despite the name on the map, there are no pigs here. Whatever this farm used to raise, it isn't raising it anymore, and the reason why becomes clear only if you are foolish enough or curious enough to stay for dinner. The farm is home to a brother and sister, Bray and Tammy Aberdeen, and their introduction plays almost like an act of hospitality straight out of an old fairy tale. The kind where you already suspect the friendly cottage in the woods is hiding something, and you walk toward it anyway because the story demands it. That resemblance is likely not accidental, based on how closely the structure lines up with a much older storytelling pattern. A lone traveller lured in by warmth and a hot meal, only to discover the hosts have been quietly murdering guests for years. Echoes of folk tradition considerably older than the Benders themselves, stretching back through centuries of European fairy tales about witches and ogres who use hospitality as bait, the gingerbread cottage in the forest being only the most famous surviving example of a story pattern that shows up in one form or another in nearly every culture's oldest cautionary tales. It stands to reason that Rockstar didn't need to invent this particular horror from scratch, and one could read the whole sequence as an old warning about trusting strangers who offer food and shelter too easily, simply relocated onto the American frontier, dressed in period-appropriate clothing, and given teeth by a very real 19th century crime. Approach the house, and the pair greets you warmly from the porch, inviting Arthur inside for dinner and drinks. Accept, and you're free to explore a little before the meal, which is exactly what a careful player should do, because the house is full of quiet, awful details waiting to be found by anyone willing to look. Upstairs, in a bedroom, sits a family portrait on a bedside table, and in that portrait, the faces of the parents have been deliberately crossed out, scratched away as though someone wanted to erase them entirely from memory. Nearby, inside an armoire, a careful search turns up a skull and scattered bones. If you ask Bray or Tammy about it directly, their response is unnervingly casual. They simply explain, without any apparent distress, that these are the remains of their mother and that they never quite got around to burying her. Dinner itself becomes the game's true trap. Sit at the table, and Tammy encourages Arthur to drink, refilling his glass and pressing him to take another and then another. Accept enough of these drinks, generally around 3, and Arthur's vision begins to swim exactly the way it does when a character in this game is genuinely drunk, the screen tilting and blurring in that familiar, woozy way. Except this isn't ordinary liquor. It's poison, carefully dosed and disguised as frontier hospitality, and Arthur eventually loses consciousness entirely. He wakes sometime later in a ditch, stripped of his money, with another body lying on top of him. That detail alone would be disturbing enough on his own, but the game pushes it further. Depending on how the encounter unfolds and which choices a player makes, Arthur can find himself waking not simply in a random ditch, but in what amounts to a mass grave, a pit already occupied by the remains of previous, less fortunate guests who accepted the same dinner invitation and never made it back out. Whatever the Aberdeens have been doing out here, alone, at the edge of the map, it has clearly been going on for some time, and it has clearly claimed more than one traveller before Arthur ever rode up their dirt trail. Returning to confront the siblings after waking from the poisoning triggers an immediate and total shift in tone. Whatever warmth the Aberdeens displayed during dinner evaporates instantly. Tammy meets Arthur downstairs armed with a knife, while Bray waits above with a gun, and the encounter becomes a straightforward, violent fight for survival, stripped of any pretense of hospitality. Should Arthur search the house thoroughly afterward, further secrets come to light. Behind the mother's portrait in the main room lies a hidden safe holding the family's stolen wealth. A loose floor panel near the upstairs banister conceals jewellery, presumably taken from past victims. And in a hidden shed on the property's west side, a lockbox holds still more cash. Money that clearly did not come from selling pork. There is a particular detail in how the encounter is staged that rewards close attention. Before dinner ever begins, if Arthur agrees to follow Bray upstairs, he's asked to check on Tammy, who is supposedly getting dressed in her room. Arriving there catches her mid-change, and she responds not with embarrassment but with a series of flirtatious, faintly manipulative remarks, testing Arthur's reaction, gauging how comfortable or uncomfortable he seems with the exchange. It plays in the moment like a small, slightly awkward beat of frontier flirtation, the kind of scene that could exist in a dozen other stranger missions without a hint of menace attached to it. Only in hindsight, once the poison and the pit and the bones in the armoire have all come to light, does the scene reveal itself as something closer to a lure, one more small piece of theatre designed to keep a wary traveller comfortable and off guard just long enough to sit down at that table. After taking care of the Aberdeen twins, the sheer volume of hidden wealth scattered across this modest, unremarkable-looking farm speaks to just how long the siblings must have been running this operation, and just how many travellers came up this same dirt trail before Arthur ever did, drawn in by the same warm greeting, seated at the same table, and never seen again. It's worth remembering, too, that nothing about the farm's outward appearance would ever tip off a passing rider. There's no sign warning travellers away, no reputation whispered about in nearby pleasance that the game ever surfaces through dialogue or newspaper. Bray and Tammy have apparently operated in total secrecy for long enough to accumulate a genuine fortune, which means whatever official presence exists in this stretch of rural Lemoyne, sparse as it already is out here near the new Hanover border, has never once connected the disappearances along this road back to the friendly siblings running the quiet little pig farm at the end of it. The historical case behind this stranger mission is worth understanding in its own right, because the parallel runs deeper than most players realize. The real Bender family settled on a stretch of the Osage Trail in Labette County, Kansas, sometime around 1870, and operated what amounted to a combination inn and small general store out of a modest one-room cabin. The family divided that single room with a canvas curtain, creating a front section for travellers and a private section behind it. Guests were invited to sit at a specific place of honour at the dinner table, positioned so that their head rested directly against the canvas from the other side. While Kate Bender, young and by most contemporary accounts strikingly charismatic, distracted the guest with conversation and her own claimed talents as a spiritualist healer, one of the Bender men would creep up silently behind the curtain, and strike the unsuspecting traveller with a hammer. A trapdoor beneath the dining area dropped the body straight into the cellar, where the family finished the job and stripped the corpse of anything valuable before burying it in the orchard out back under cover of darkness. Estimates of their total victim count vary considerably, depending on the source, ranging from a confirmed 11 bodies recovered from the property to speculative totals as high as 20 or more travellers, who may have simply vanished along that same stretch of trail without ever being connected back to the family at all. The Benders were never caught. When suspicion finally closed in around the spring of 1873, the family abandoned the homestead overnight and disappeared entirely. And despite a substantial reward and more than a century of theories, sightings, and false confessions, no one has ever definitively confirmed what became of them. Rockstar has never hidden where this particular inspiration came from, and the parallel is worth sitting with because of how closely it tracks. The Aberdeens siblings are widely understood to be modelled directly on the Bloody Benders, a real family of serial killers who operated a small inn and general store in Kansas during the 1870s. The historical Benders would welcome travellers in for a meal, seat them at a specific spot at the table positioned conveniently in front of a curtain, and then kill them from behind with a hammer before robbing the bodies and burying them in the orchard out back. Investigators eventually connected the family to more than a dozen disappearances before the Benders themselves vanished, never definitively caught or identified, becoming one of the true unsolved mysteries of 19th century American crime. The Aberdeens even mirror a specific, uglier detail of that history. The two adult Bender children, widely believed to be responsible for the killings, John Jr. and Kate, were suspected by some investigators and much of the surrounding folklore to have been involved in an incestuous relationship, a suspicion that Rockstar folds directly into Bray and Tammy's dynamic as well, playing the discomfort of that implication for exactly the queasy effect it's designed to produce. There is one detail the game deliberately leaves unresolved, and it's the detail that tends to linger longest with players who go looking into the farm's history after the fact. Despite everything the encounter implies, despite the tone the whole sequence is clearly reaching for, there is no definitive confirmed evidence within the game that the Aberdeens actually eat their victims. The farm's name, its earlier purpose, raising pigs, the isolated setting, the family's total lack of remorse, all of it leans hard into the cannibal hillbilly archetype that horror fiction has used for decades, and the implication sits heavy in the air the entire time you're in that house. But implication is all it ever is. No note confirms it. No item found on the property offers proof one way or the other. The game seems content to let players' imaginations do the rest of the work, trusting that the atmosphere alone, the bones in the armoire, the crossed-out faces in the portrait, the casual cruelty of two siblings who murder travellers as a matter of routine, will be more than enough to leave a lasting impression, without ever needing to spell out the very worst possibility in plain text. There's a particular unease in how ordinary the whole encounter is designed to feel, right up until the moment it isn't. Nothing about the Aberdeens' initial greeting differs meaningfully from dozens of other friendly frontier characters scattered across the map. People who invite Arthur in for a drink, share a story, offer a small piece of hospitality in exchange for company. That familiarity is exactly what makes the farm so effective. The game has spent hours training players to expect warmth from strangers who behave this way, and then it uses that trained expectation against you, turning a routine dinner invitation into one of the most quietly disturbing set pieces in the entire story. Players who approach the farm having already heard whispers about it online often report the tension feels different, knowing something is wrong from the start and drinking anyway, testing exactly how far the game will let the horror go before it finally shows its hand. If Arthur chooses mercy and leaves the Aberdeens alive, rather than killing them outright, there's a final, quiet detail that closes out their story. Return to the farm during the game's epilogue. Once John Marston has taken over as the playable character, and the Aberdeens are simply gone. The house standing empty, whatever they were doing out there apparently concluded or relocated somewhere the story no longer follows. Whether they moved on to another isolated farm, another unsuspecting traveller, another dinner table set with poison and good intentions, is left entirely to the imagination of whoever plays through it. The frontier, it seems, has room enough for stories like theirs to simply continue somewhere just out of sight. The Voice in the Rocks. The legend of Bigfoot has followed Rockstar Games through nearly every open world they built since 2004, when the first whispered rumors of a hairy, hulking figure lurking in the hills of San Andreas sent players combing that game's countryside for years afterward. The creature, or some version of it, has since turned up in one form or another across the Grand Theft Auto series and the original Red Dead Redemption, becoming something of a running signature for the studio, a piece of folklore they seem determined to keep alive no matter how many times players fail to definitively prove or disprove its existence. That original San Andreas rumor, largely fueled by a grainy, unverified screenshot and word of mouth, rather than anything concrete the developers ever confirmed, became one of gaming's earliest viral urban legends, spreading through message boards and playground conversation long before social media existed to accelerate that kind of speculation. Rockstar never definitively confirmed or denied it, and that silence alone was enough to keep players searching for years. The studio revisited the idea more explicitly in Grand Theft Auto 5, hiding cryptic imagery near the base of Mount Chiliad that fans spent years attempting to decode, and Red Dead Redemption's own zombie-themed expansion, Undead Nightmare, went even further, turning the legend into an actual huntable questline, where players could track and fight a small population of Sasquatches directly. Red Dead Redemption 2 continues that tradition, and it does so across two entirely separate discoveries, tucked into opposite corners of the map, that together paint a picture stranger and sadder than a simple monster hunt. The Mount Chiliad rumor deserves a little more context, since it's the single closest precedent to what players would go on to build around Mount Shann. Grand Theft Auto 5 hid a series of cryptic murals and symbols around the base of that mountain, imagery that seemed to hint at an alien-related cataclysm and drew years of sustained community investigation. Entire forums and video series devoted to decoding what the symbols meant and whether some larger event was meant to trigger once every piece was found. Rockstar never fully resolved that mystery either, and the parallel between Mount Chiliad's alien iconography and Mount Shann's own combination of extraterrestrial lights and giant skeletal remains feels far too deliberate to be coincidence, as though the studio understood exactly what kind of obsessive attention hiding a mystery on a mountain peak tends to generate, and built Red Dead Redemption 2's own version, fully expecting the same reaction. The first piece of evidence sits atop Mount Shann itself, the same mountain already tied to the game's UFO mystery, which is a detail worth noting on its own. Climbing to the mountain's peak and searching near a spot where an eagle can often be seen perched at the cliff's edge, players who look to the left will find a narrow, easily overlooked path, hidden behind a screen of plants. Following it leads down into a small cave, and inside that cave rests something that should not be there. An enormous skeleton, clearly humanoid in shape but scaled up well beyond what any ordinary person could have been. Arthur, upon finding it, makes a sketch in his journal, and the description he writes down carries an appropriate note of unease. He wonders how large the man must have been, and then, almost as an afterthought, wonders whether he was a man at all. The second piece of the puzzle lies far to the north and requires considerably more effort to uncover. Before this encounter can even begin, a player needs to have studied at least 30 different animal species across the map, logging them properly in the compendium through observation or hunting. Once that threshold is met, the path forward opens near the Wapiti Indian Reservation, close to the western shore of the river that winds through the area. On a clear day, sometime between 8 in the morning and 8 at night, a flock of birds will occasionally appear near the water's edge. If you follow them on horseback as they take flight, they lead east, deeper and deeper into increasingly rugged terrain, eventually guiding you toward the rocky high ground north of the train tracks near O'Cree's Run. Somewhere in that stretch of mountains lies a den, blocked by a boulder, and it's here that something unseen finally speaks. The voice that greets you from inside the cave describes itself in fragments, refusing to fully step into view, explaining instead that it is simply too large to come out. Pressed further, it mentions offhandedly that it has children of its own, describing them, with what almost sounds like a note of exhausted humor, as being too big themselves. Creatures that eat too much and would only cause trouble if anyone ever saw them. There is a wistfulness to the conversation as well. The voice admits to a kind of loneliness, mentioning that it sometimes wishes for a wife, before immediately talking itself out of the idea, reasoning that women can be cruel, and that nobody wants children who eat as much as its own apparently do. It is, in its own strange way, one of the more oddly human conversations tucked anywhere into Red Dead Redemption 2's enormous cast of incidental characters, delivered entirely by a disembodied voice from behind a rock, belonging to a creature the player is never once permitted to actually see. Should you choose to return to the same spot roughly 3 in-game days later, a second conversation becomes available, offering a little more insight into this lonely, hidden creature's existence, though never quite enough to resolve who or what it truly is. After this second exchange, the encounter closes, and as far as anyone has been able to determine through years of exhaustive searching, there is no further escalation, no eventual reveal, no moment where the boulder finally rolls aside and the voice steps into the light. The connection between these two discoveries has fueled endless speculation ever since players first pieced them together. Is the skeleton on Mount Shann the remains of an earlier, now dead member of the same species the voice in the northern cave belongs to? Evidence that these creatures have existed and died out here for generations, their bones simply waiting in high, cold places for a curious traveler to stumble across them? Or is the skeleton something else entirely? A coincidence, a leftover reference to something biblical, a nod toward the Nephilim described in certain religious texts as giants born from the union of divine and mortal beings. The game offers no definitive answer connecting the two locations, no note, no letter, no piece of dialogue that ties them together explicitly, leaving players free to draw whatever line between them feels most satisfying, or to conclude that no line was ever meant to be drawn at all. What makes this particular mystery so effective, more than perhaps any other supernatural thread in the game, is Rockstar's refusal to ever let players actually see the creature in question. Every other unexplained encounter in this list eventually offers some visual payoff, a light in the sky, a figure in the fog, a vampire caught mid-feed in an alley. The giant of the grizzlies offers only a voice, patient and a little sad, drifting out from behind an immovable stone, discussing loneliness and family and the particular cruelty of being too large for the world around you to accept. It is, in some strange way, one of the gentlest encounters in this entire list, a creature that wants nothing from Arthur beyond a moment of company and conversation, content to remain hidden, unseen, and largely unbothered by a world of hunters and outlaws who would almost certainly kill it on sight if they ever got the chance to look it in the eye. It's worth remembering, too, just how demanding the requirements are for reaching this encounter at all, a detail that separates it from nearly everything else on this list. 30 distinct animal species is not a small ask. It requires deliberate, patient engagement with the game's hunting and observation systems across nearly every biome the map has to offer. Tracking down creatures in the swamps of Lemoyne, the deserts of New Austin, the forests of the Grizzlies, and the plains of the Heartlands, each one demanding its own approach, its own patience, its own understanding of how that particular animal behaves. Only a player already deeply invested in the game's systems, already committed to treating this frontier as something worth studying rather than simply passing through, will ever meet the threshold required to follow those birds east toward the cave. In a strange way, that gatekeeping mirrors the giant's own personality as revealed in conversation, cautious, private, willing to speak only to someone who has already proven, through sustained effort, that they understand this wilderness well enough to be trusted with the secret, this fragile. There's a melancholy thread running through the giant's dialogue that separates him from almost every other unexplained figure in this list. He isn't hiding because he's dangerous, or because he's ashamed, or because some dark ritual demands his secrecy. He's hiding, by his own account, simply because he doesn't fit, because a world built for smaller creatures has no comfortable place for someone as large as he apparently is. That loneliness, offered so plainly and without any dramatic flourish, lands with a weight that few of the game's other mysteries manage to match. Bigfoot, in this telling, isn't a monster waiting to be hunted. He's simply someone who has learned the hard way that the safest life is one lived entirely out of sight. The man out of time. West of Strawberry, tucked into the hills of Big Valley, sits a modest cabin known as Hawk's Eye, and it's here, sometime after Arthur reaches Chapter 2 of his story, that players first encounter one of the strangest human characters in the entire game. A man steps out to meet you, well-groomed, dressed in clothing that immediately looks slightly wrong for the setting. A checkered knit sweater over a collared shirt and tie. High-waisted khaki trousers held up with a belt, rather than the suspenders every other man on this frontier seems to favor. He introduces himself as Francis Sinclair, and almost immediately, his manner of speaking marks him as something other than ordinary. His opening line to Arthur is almost comically out of place for the year 1899, greeting him with something close to, well, "What's eating you, partner?" A breezy, casual turn of phrase that lands on Arthur's ear as pure nonsense, the kind of slang that wouldn't actually enter common American usage for decades still to come. He continues in that same register throughout the entire conversation. Expressions Arthur has clearly never encountered before and doesn't fully understand, though he plays along well enough to keep the conversation moving. Francis explains that he's a collector, and he wants help finding a series of rock carvings scattered across the wilderness, offering to pay handsomely for the effort. He hands over a business card, its logo an hourglass fitted with a pair of wings, a small detail that reads as decorative at first glance and considerably more pointed once you understand what the rest of this strange mission is building toward. The quest itself is straightforward on paper. Locate 10 separate rock carvings hidden across wildly different corners of the map, from the shore of Lake Owanjila near Strawberry to the peak of Mount Hagen far to the west, from a burned-out settlement north of Flatneck Station to a rocky ledge near Roanoke Ridge in the opposite corner of the territory entirely. Each carving depicts something, and it isn't until you've gathered a good number of them that the pattern starts to feel genuinely unsettling. The carvings show scenes that have no business existing on rock faces in this particular frontier. Some depict recognizable moments from deep human history: the construction of the pyramids, the invention of the wheel. Others show things that should be centuries beyond the comprehension of anyone living in 1899. A double helix, unmistakable in its structure, appears among the carvings despite the fact that the actual scientific discovery of DNA's double helix shape did not occur in the real world until 1953, more than half a century after the events of this game take place. Other carvings show towering skyscrapers, dense futuristic metropolises, and, most disturbing of all, what appears to be a nuclear explosion, its shape unmistakable even rendered in crude stone etching. The geographic spread of these 10 carvings is worth appreciating on its own, because it means completing this quest requires crossing nearly the entire map from end to end. Beyond the two already mentioned near Strawberry and Mount Shann, carvings turn up along the southwestern shore of Lake Owanjila, atop the wind-scoured peak of Mount Hagen, far to the west in Grizzly's West, among the wreckage of a burned-out settlement north of Flatneck Station, on a cliffside above a rope bridge near Cumberland Forest, and on a rock ledge deep in the opposite corner of the map near Roanoke Ridge, along with several others tucked into terrain that ranges from scorched desert to frozen mountain pass. No single region holds more than one or two of them. Whoever or whatever scattered these carvings across the world did so with total disregard for how far apart they'd force a searching traveler to ride, and completing the collection means experiencing nearly every biome and climate the game has to offer in a single unbroken chain of searching. Once all 10 carvings have been located and their positions mailed off from a post office, as Francis requests, a waiting period passes before a return letter arrives, inviting Arthur back to the cabin at Hawk's Eye. What awaits there is the true payoff of the entire questline, and it's genuinely strange even by the standards of everything else on this list. Francis himself is nowhere to be found. In his place is a woman who introduces herself as Mrs. Sinclair, holding an infant in her arms. When Arthur asks after her husband, she explains, plainly and without any apparent grief, that he died more than a year ago. Pressed further, she reveals that her husband's name was not Francis at all, but Tom. The baby in her arms, she says, is the one actually named Francis. And there, on the infant's face, is the same conspicuous birthmark that sat over the adult Francis Sinclair's right eye during every previous conversation. Inside the cabin, a mural now covers one wall, assembled from drawings that mirror the carvings Arthur spent hours tracking down. At its center stands a figure who looks remarkably like Francis, appearing to step directly into some kind of portal, flanked on one side by ancient imagery, the Sphinx, the pyramids of Giza, and on the other by the unmistakable skyline of a modern industrialized city. The mural, notably, closely echoes the composition of a real historical piece of art called Man at the Crossroads, a mural originally commissioned from the artist Diego Rivera, that depicted humanity poised between competing ideological paths. Francis's version reframes that same crossroads not as a choice between capitalism and socialism, but as a literal crossroads of time itself, with a man standing at the center of it all. There's a wry irony worth noting in the name Rockstar gave this stranger mission strand. Geology for Beginners frames the entire quest line as a simple lesson in reading rock formations, the kind of dry, educational title you'd expect, attached to a quest about identifying mineral deposits or fossil beds. It's a title that actively undersells everything the mission eventually reveals, and that mismatch between a mundane label and an increasingly impossible payoff seems entirely intentional. Another small way the game hides its strangest content behind the least suspicious packaging it can manage. Players who skip stranger missions, they assume, will be dull based on their titles alone are, in this one specific case, walking past one of the most genuinely mind-bending threads the entire story has to offer. No further explanation ever arrives. The prevailing theory that has taken hold across the community, built entirely from these pieces and never confirmed by anything Rockstar has officially stated, holds that Francis Sinclair is trapped in an endless loop, traveling backward through time to be reborn again and again into the same small cabin outside Strawberry, living out a version of his life before eventually setting the same events in motion that will send him traveling once more. Under this reading, the rock carvings are not simply objects Francis once collected for a collector's curiosity. They are fragments of his own memory, physical anchors scattered by some earlier version of himself, meant to be gathered by an unwitting traveller, so the cycle can complete itself and begin again. Whether Arthur is meant to understand himself as an active participant in maintaining this loop, or merely an unknowing tool caught up in events far larger than one outlaw's story, the game never says. A smaller, more playful theory has also taken root among longtime followers of Rockstar's other franchise, connecting Francis Sinclair to a fictional cult called the Epsilon Program that appears in the Grand Theft Auto universe, a group that worships a deity named Kraft, and specifically venerates individuals born with a distinctive birthmark over the right eye as descendants of that god. The connection is almost certainly not meant to be read as a literal crossover between the two separate game universes, since Rockstar has never confirmed any shared continuity between its major franchises. But the parallel is close enough and specific enough that many players treat it as at least a deliberate wink from the writers, a small acknowledgement that whatever Francis Sinclair actually is, he belongs to a very particular strain of cosmic weirdness that Rockstar seems to enjoy tucking into the margins of even its most grounded, historically faithful worlds. There's also the question of who placed the carvings in the first place, a detail that tends to get lost amid the more dazzling implications of time travel and reincarnation. Someone had to physically carve these images into rock faces scattered across an enormous stretch of wilderness, using tools and techniques that would have taken considerable time and effort, all before Arthur ever arrives to find them. If Francis is indeed the one responsible, it would mean an earlier iteration of him, perhaps decades earlier, perhaps centuries, moved through this same landscape, leaving a trail of clues meant for a version of himself, or for whoever eventually helps trigger the cycle to begin again. That raises an even stranger possibility. Perhaps Francis has done this before, many times, in many forms, across many loops of the same unbroken chain. And the Francis Arthur meets is neither the first nor the last, simply the current link in a chain stretching backward and forward through history, in directions the game has no interest in mapping for you. There's a quiet horror buried in that reading, one separate from anything overtly supernatural. If Francis truly is trapped in an endless cycle, reborn again and again into the same small cabin, living out some version of the same short life before vanishing and starting over, then his existence amounts to a kind of prison, however gentle its bars might look from the outside. He seems, in his conversations with Arthur, cheerful, energetic, entirely untroubled by whatever strange force governs his existence. Whether that cheerfulness reflects genuine contentment, or simply a mind that has forgotten, loop after loop, that anything is wrong with its situation at all, is a question the game leaves entirely to the listener's own imagination. What remains, at the end of it all, is a quest that gives you everything except an answer. A man who speaks in a dialect that shouldn't exist yet. A wardrobe pulled from a future decade. 10 carvings depicting events that stretch across the entirety of human history and beyond it. A wife who insists her husband has been dead for over a year, cradling an infant who somehow already carries the mark of the man Arthur only just finished speaking with days earlier. The frontier, it turns out, has room for time travelers too, and like so much else out here, it never once bothers to explain how or why or what any of it actually means. 5 words on a wall. St. Denis, for all its cathedral bells and riverside cafes, is a city that Red Dead Redemption 2 never lets you fully trust. Beneath the wealth and the architecture, the game keeps hinting at rot, corruption, disease and desperation pressed together in close quarters. And nowhere does that undercurrent surface more directly than in the case of the figure most players simply call the St. Denis vampire. Unlike many of the mysteries scattered elsewhere across the map, this one comes with an unmistakably clear trail. 5 separate pieces of writing scrawled across walls throughout the city, and following that trail to its conclusion, leads directly to one of the most genuinely frightening encounters the game has to offer. The writings themselves are worth lingering on, because they read less like a puzzle and more like the fevered confession of someone spiraling towards something terrible. The first, found on the southeastern wall of the general store near the train tracks, reads simply, 5 bones under the perfect star. Nosferatu with Dominica will become mortal again. The second, tucked into an alleyway near the Fontana Theatre, grows more intimate and disturbing in tone. O sweetest of napes, may your blood remain forever on my lips. 6 there will be before the lust is sated. A third message, found behind the gunsmith, continues in the same voice. With one long kiss I draw the life from her and await the outpost of the advancing day. A fourth, near the market's trapper stall, states plainly, I feed again the blood of life, the circle has begun. And the 5th and final message, discovered near the northeastern saloon, closes the sequence with an almost liturgical finality. I drink from the maiden, and I live again in the dead, the heart of the ring of blood. Once all 5 writings have been examined and logged into Arthur's journal, something clicks into place almost literally. A crude star, drawn by connecting the locations of each message, appears sketched across a map of the city, and at its rough center sits a narrow, unassuming alleyway just south of St. Denis's Cathedral, directly across from a butcher's shop, a detail that feels almost too perfectly grim to be coincidental. The location only becomes active between midnight and 1 in the morning, and if a player approaches during that narrow window, a small marker denoting a corpse will appear on the map, confirming that something has already happened there that night, or is about to. Walking into that alley delivers exactly what 5 increasingly unsettling messages promised. a pale figure crouches over a fresh body, feeding. Dressed in a long black coat with dark trousers and strange red gauntlets, features difficult to make out clearly in the dim alley light, but unmistakably wrong. Long bat-like ears and teeth sharpened to points that catch what little illumination the scene offers. He notices Arthur immediately, and depending on how the player chooses to proceed, either provoking him or simply lingering too long nearby, the vampire attacks with a distinctive ornate dagger, a weapon capable of killing Arthur in a single devastating hit if the player isn't careful. Defeating him rewards a strange little collection of trophies, stringy meat, and a pair of bat wings looted from his body, along with the dagger itself, a silver-bladed gold-handled weapon that serves as one of the more unusual collectible items available anywhere in the game. There's a curious wrinkle in his behavior worth mentioning for anyone tempted to take a non-lethal approach. The game allows Arthur to lasso and hogtie nearly any human character he encounters, a mechanic normally used to capture bounty targets alive rather than kill them outright. Attempt it on the vampire, and the restraint doesn't hold the way it does against ordinary outlaws. Cut him loose afterward, and he simply continues his attack as though the rope had never touched him at all, capable of ending Arthur's life with a single strike even unarmed. It's a small mechanical detail, easy to dismiss as nothing more than the game's combat systems failing to account for such an unusual, rarely triggered encounter. But it lands as one more quiet confirmation that ordinary frontier tools, rope, restraint, the law's usual methods of subduing a dangerous man, simply do not apply to whatever this particular resident of St. Denis actually is. The character's design draws unmistakably from Count Orlok, the ghastly central figure of the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, itself an unauthorized and famously eerie adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. That film's production history carries its own strange footnote worth knowing. Stoker's widow, upset that the studio behind Nosferatu had never secured proper rights to adapt her late husband's novel, successfully sued and won a court order demanding every copy of the film be destroyed. A small number of prints survived in scattered corners of the world regardless, smuggled and hidden by admirers who couldn't bear to see the film erased. And those surviving copies are the only reason Count Orlok's gaunt, rat-like silhouette still exists in the public imagination at all today, let alone as a direct visual reference tucked into a game released nearly a century later. The reference is confirmed almost explicitly by the writings themselves, which invoke the name Nosferatu directly in the very first message a player is likely to find. Newspapers scattered elsewhere throughout St. Denis, easy to miss amid the game's enormous volume of readable material, apparently reference a string of unsolved local murders around the same time, implying that this figure has already claimed at least 5 victims before Arthur ever crosses his path, with the messages themselves suggesting he intends for a 6th, to complete whatever ritual or hunger drives him. There's a small detail worth noting about what the encounter leaves behind afterward as well. Beyond the ornate dagger itself, defeating the vampire yields a pair of bat wings and a portion of what the game simply labels stringy meat, unusual loot that exists nowhere else tied to any human enemy anywhere in the game. Ordinary outlaws and lawmen drop money, ammunition, tobacco, the mundane detritus of frontier life. This particular kill drops the same kind of item you'd expect from harvesting an actual bat out in the wilderness, a small mechanical detail that quietly confirms, at the level of raw game data, if nowhere else, that whatever the developers intended this figure to be, he was never meant to register as fully human. What the game never explains, and seemingly has no interest in explaining, is what this creature actually is. Is he a genuine supernatural vampire, centuries old exactly as his own dialogue during the encounter claims, drawn to this particular corner of Louisiana-inspired swampland for reasons the game never bothers to justify? Or is he simply a deeply disturbed individual, a serial killer who has convinced himself, through whatever combination of delusion and obsession, that he is something ancient and undead, acting out an elaborate ritual entirely of his own invention, writing cryptic manifestos on the walls of the city he's terrorizing because some part of him needs an audience, even an unknowing one? Both readings sit comfortably within everything else Red Dead Redemption 2 does with its supernatural threads. This is, after all, a game that also gives players a witch's cauldron with genuinely restorative magical properties, and a mountain where actual lights appear in the sky on schedule, so a literal vampire wouldn't necessarily be out of place. And yet the game's broader commitment to historical grounding, its refusal to ever step fully into fantasy, leaves just enough room to read him as a man rather than a monster, which somehow makes the whole encounter feel even worse. There's a small, chilling detail worth noting for anyone who lingers on the encounter rather than simply drawing their weapon. Before he attacks, the vampire actually speaks to Arthur, and depending on how the conversation is allowed to play out, he offers a kind of threat, or perhaps an invitation, suggesting that Arthur could share his fate if he doesn't leave the alley immediately. It's a small moment, easy to miss in the chaos of drawing a weapon and preparing for a difficult fight, but it adds one more layer of unease to an encounter already stacked with them. The suggestion that whatever this figure is, human or otherwise, he genuinely believes there is a version of this exchange where Arthur simply joins him instead of fighting him. Consider, too, the sheer effort required to bring this figure into existence at all. 5 separate messages, hidden across an enormous, densely detailed city, each one requiring a player to notice handwriting scrawled inconspicuously against brick and wood in areas most travelers would walk straight past without a second glance. St. Denis is the largest, most architecturally dense settlement anywhere on the map, modeled loosely after New Orleans with touches of Paris folded into its boulevards and courtyards. And finding 5 small pieces of graffiti scattered somewhere within all of that requires either remarkable luck or the kind of deliberate patient searching that only the most dedicated players tend to undertake. For everyone else, the vampire simply never exists. He remains forever undiscovered, feeding somewhere in that alley on nights nobody happens to walk past. His 5 victims never avenged. His 6th kill perhaps still waiting to happen in a version of St. Denis no player will ever witness. There's a bleak symmetry worth noting between this encounter and the Aberdeens pig farm explored earlier. Both hide predators behind the outward appearance of ordinary frontier life. One wrapped in false hospitality, the other in graffiti easily mistaken for meaningless vandalism. Both require the player to actively seek out horror rather than stumble into it passively. And both, once uncovered, offer no explanation beyond what can be read directly off the walls or gathered directly from bones in an armoire, trusting the player's imagination to fill in everything the game itself refuses to spell out. St. Denis, for all its cathedral bells and riverside charm, seems to specialize in exactly this kind of quiet, patient predation, dressed up just convincingly enough that most of its citizens never think to look twice. By the time the confrontation ends one way or another, the deeper questions remain exactly where they started. Who was he before this began? What drove a man, or whatever he truly is, to scrawl 5 confessions across the walls of a city and wait patiently in the dark for someone to finally read them and come looking? The game answers none of it, content instead to leave Arthur standing over a body in an alley near a cathedral, an ornate dagger in hand, 5 cryptic messages logged in his journal, and absolutely no closer to understanding what, exactly, St. Denis has been hiding in its shadows all along. The Bouncing Boy. In the northeastern reaches of the map, past the smoke and industry of Ansburg, a strange laboratory sits at a place called Doverhill, and it belongs to a man who might be the single strangest human character Arthur Morgan ever crosses paths with in the entirety of his story. His name is Marco Dragic, and he first appears not at his lab, but in a public park in western St. Denis, standing beside a pond, clearly agitated, in the middle of preparing some kind of demonstration. Dragic explains in a thick accent and with the manic energy of a man utterly convinced of his own genius that he's an inventor and professor, and that he intends to showcase a remarkable new piece of technology to a group of potential investors gathered nearby. The demonstration turns out to be a small remote-controlled boat, operated entirely through radio waves and electricity. Technology that would have genuinely seemed like science fiction to most people living in 1899. Because the investors are wary of the device being secretly rigged, they insist that someone with no technical understanding operate it publicly, and Arthur, naturally, ends up in the role. The demonstration itself plays out as a small, controlled game within the game, guiding the little boat around a pond littered with floating mines, sinking a series of model warships, while Dragic narrates his own brilliance from the sidelines. It's playful, almost comic in tone, the kind of stranger mission that seems designed purely for a moment of light-hearted spectacle. That tone shifts considerably when the second part of the mission begins. Several in-game days later, players can travel to Dragic's actual laboratory at Doverhill, but only at night, and only during an active thunderstorm. Approaching the building in these conditions reveals Dragic in a state of genuine paranoia, speaking to Arthur through some kind of hidden microphone, rather than showing himself directly, convinced that whoever has arrived might be there to rob him. Once he recognizes Arthur and steps out of hiding, he explains what he actually needs help with this time. Something considerably more ambitious than a toy boat. He wants to harness electricity directly from the storm raging outside. Arthur is tasked with planting 3 metal conducting rods at specific points around the property, using a handheld detector to locate the correct spots in near total darkness. An eerie task made stranger by the storm crashing overhead. While placing them, a pack of wolves can sometimes be spotted moving through the darkness at a distance, and if the timing lines up just right, the storm itself finishes them, a stray bolt of lightning striking the pack dead where they stand. It's a small, unscripted detail rather than a guaranteed story beat, but players who witness it have noted something genuinely strange about the aftermath. The wolves, struck dead by the same storm Dragic is actively trying to harness for his own purposes, can still be skinned afterward, and their pelts come away in flawless, undamaged condition despite having just been killed by a direct hit of lightning, as though the storm here obeys rules a little different from the ones governing weather anywhere else on the map. Once all 3 rods are placed, Dragic asks for one final piece of help, sending Arthur to climb a metal tower attached to the lab and flip a specific sequence of switches to complete the circuit. When the switches are thrown, the storm's electricity floods into the laboratory, and Dragic reveals the true purpose behind everything Arthur has just helped him accomplish. He isn't simply studying electricity, he's attempting to create life. A large, mechanical figure, roughly humanoid, powers up under the storm's charge, takes several halting, jerking steps forward, and then collapses onto the floor. Dragic, rather than despairing at what looks like an obvious failure, seems almost thrilled with the result, treating even this brief stumbling movement as proof of concept. The inspiration behind Dragic is not subtle, and Rockstar seems entirely comfortable wearing it openly. His accent, his laboratory, his obsession with electricity and remote-controlled machinery all point unmistakably toward Nikola Tesla, the real historical inventor famous for both his genuine scientific breakthroughs and his increasingly grandiose, sometimes unrealized later ambitions. The remote-controlled boat Arthur operates during the first mission is a direct nod to an actual invention Tesla demonstrated in 1898. A radio-controlled boat he called the teleautomaton, presented to a stunned and somewhat disbelieving public as an early glimpse of a wireless future. The real demonstration took place at an electrical exhibition inside the recently completed Madison Square Garden, where Tesla filled an indoor pool with water and set a small iron-hulled boat loose upon it, steering it entirely through wireless radio signals sent from a control box fitted with levers. The crowd that witnessed it had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Some assumed Tesla was somehow controlling the vessel with his own mind. Others became convinced a trained monkey must be hidden somewhere inside the hull, quietly working the controls from within. Tesla, delighting in the confusion, reportedly encouraged onlookers to shout questions at the boat itself, then answered by flashing its onboard lights in response, deepening the audience's conviction that they were witnessing something closer to sorcery than engineering. He later described the vessel, in his own words, as having been fitted with a borrowed mind, a phrase that captures almost exactly the same eerie quality Rockstar reaches for when Dragic's own creation finally lurches to life under a stolen bolt of lightning more than a century later. Dragic even complains at one point about a silver-tongued American who betrayed him, a clear echo of Tesla's well-documented rivalry with Thomas Edison, a conflict that shaped much of Tesla's later career and reputation. Layered on top of the Tesla parallel is an equally obvious nod to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, with Dragic cast as a frontier-era victor, driven by the same reckless hunger to create life through unnatural means, seemingly blind to any question of whether he should. That parallel becomes devastatingly literal by the mission's final chapter. After allowing another 2 full days to pass in-game, players who return to the laboratory find the door already unlocked, and inside, Marko Dragic lies dead on the floor in a spreading pool of blood, seemingly murdered, his robotic creation nowhere to be found. Beside his body sits an electric lantern, left behind almost like a final gift or a grim consolation prize for whoever comes looking. There's no immediate resolution offered here either, no confession, no witness, no obvious suspect standing over the body. Dragic is simply gone, and so, apparently, is the machine he spent the entire questline building. The true final piece of this story requires traveling to an entirely different corner of the map, far to the west, high in the snow-choked mountains of the Grizzlies, overlooking the abandoned mining town of Coulter. There, on a narrow exposed ledge, sits the robot itself, motionless in the snow, quietly repeating a single word over and over to nobody in particular. Papa. Whether Dragic's creation somehow turned on its own creator in a moment that echoes Frankenstein's monster almost too perfectly to be coincidental, or whether some other party entirely, a jealous rival, an intruder drawn by rumors of the invention, killed Dragic and simply abandoned the machine afterward, the game leaves entirely open. Players are given the option to shoot the robot where it sits, ending its strange vigil for good, or to simply walk away and leave it there, calling out for a father who will never answer, sitting in the snow above a ghost town that has already claimed enough tragedy of its own without this addition. Finding it requires a piece of equipment the game hands you at the exact moment it takes Dragic away. The electric lantern left beside his body isn't simply a memento or a strange collectible with no further purpose. It's a genuinely rare light source, unlike anything else available to Arthur through ordinary means, casting a brighter, steadier beam than any torch or standard lantern found elsewhere in the game. And it happens to be the specific tool most players use to actually locate the robot itself once they make the long ride out to the Grizzlies looking for it. There's something quietly poetic in that detail, whether or not it was designed with any symbolism in mind. The last gift Dragic ever gives the world is a small light stolen from a dead man's workshop, and that same light is what leads Arthur, days later and hundreds of miles away, straight to the one thing Dragic ever managed to bring fully into being. There's a particular cruelty in exactly where the developers chose to place the robot's final resting spot. Coulter is not a random patch of snow somewhere in the Grizzlies. It is the site of one of the story's earliest and most devastating tragedies, the abandoned mining town where Arthur and the rest of the Van der Linde gang endured a brutal winter early in the game, a chapter defined by cold, starvation, and loss before the story has even properly begun. Placing Dragic's grieving, wandering creation on a ledge overlooking that same town links two entirely separate threads of tragedy that otherwise share no narrative connection whatsoever, one belonging to Arthur's personal story, the other to a stranger he barely knew, both converging on the same frozen, forgotten patch of mountain, as though the game itself understands that Coulter has become something like a magnet for sorrow, drawing in anything broken enough to need somewhere quiet to finally stop moving. It's also worth sitting with what the robot actually says, because Papa is not a word Dragic ever taught it directly, at least not within anything the player witnesses. The creature emerges from its very first jolt of stolen lightning already collapsing, already failing by any reasonable measure of success, and yet somewhere in that brief, stumbling activation, it apparently absorbed enough to understand its own relationship to its creator well enough to name him, and to keep calling for him long after any signal should have told it that call would never be answered. Whether that single word represents genuine, if primitive, consciousness, or simply a fragment of program vocabulary repeating itself endlessly with no understanding behind it at all, is a question the game leaves entirely in the player's hands, standing alone on a mountain ledge, deciding whether to end its call for good or simply let it continue into the cold. What stays with most players long after finishing this particular thread isn't the mystery of who killed Dragic, though that question does linger unresolved. It's the image of that machine on the mountainside, built from stolen lightning and a dead man's obsession, calling out the same single word into an empty, freezing landscape, waiting for a creator who is never coming back to answer. What simmers in the woods, far in the northeastern reaches of Aberdeens, in the cold, remote hills of the Grizzlies' east region, well off any road a sensible traveller would normally choose. A small structure built from bundled sticks and lashed timber sits half hidden among the trees. Approaching it on foot, the first thing most players notice is the smell implied by the scene before them, even sees it clearly. Animal bones tied along the walls at waist height, candles scattered across the ground, their flames somehow steady despite the wind that cuts through this high exposed terrain. A wooden table holds a scattering of books and vials, their contents never specified, their purpose left entirely to implication. Scattered around the interior, a careful search turns up moonshine, herbivore bait, salted offal, and, oddly, 2 full bottles of snake oil, along with a small chest tucked near the entrance holding hair tonic and a bottle of Kentucky bourbon. An inventory that reads less like the belongings of a fearsome occult practitioner and more like the everyday stock of any frontier trapper or herbalist. Ordinary supplies sitting uneasily alongside candlelight and animal bone. And at the far end of this makeshift hut sits the object that gives the location its name among players. A large cauldron, its contents bubbling steadily, filled with something the game's own interface simply labels as mysterious liquid. There is a raven perched inside the structure as well, watching, and it reacts the instant anything is disturbed. Take an item from the hut, anything at all, and the bird lets out a sharp, sudden crow, breaking the silence in a way that feels less like an ambient animal sound effect and more like a deliberate alarm, as though the creature exists specifically to announce intruders to whoever or whatever might be listening elsewhere. The detail is not accidental. Ravens and crows carry centuries of association with witchcraft across numerous folk traditions, frequently appearing as familiars, animal companions believed to serve as extensions of a witch's will, sometimes even her eyes and ears, when she herself is elsewhere. The cauldron itself offers the most direct interaction available anywhere at this location. Approach it, and the game presents Arthur with the option to drink from the bubbling liquid inside. Choose to do so, and Arthur immediately blacks out, exactly as he does after Tammy Aberdeens' poisoned dinner wine, except the outcome here is entirely different. Rather than waking robbed and half-buried, Arthur comes to a short distance from the hut, with every one of his character's core attributes, health, stamina, and deadeye, fully restored and fortified, as though whatever he just drank did something to strengthen him rather than harm him. The liquid can only be consumed once. After that first drink, the option simply disappears, leaving no way to repeat the effect or study it further. What makes this location so quietly unsettling is how little context the game offers for it, and how much that absence seems to matter to the overall effect. Unlike the vampire of St. Denis, there are no letters here explaining a backstory, no newspaper clippings hinting at a string of related events. Unlike Mount Shann's aliens, there's no cult's suicide note laying out a belief system to interpret. There is only the hut itself, fully stocked, clearly still in active use, given the freshness of the herbs and the steady burn of the candles, and no owner anywhere in sight. Someone lives here, or at least visits regularly enough to keep the cauldron fed and the candles lit, and yet in all the time players have spent combing this location since the game's release, nobody has ever definitively encountered whoever that might be. There is, notably, a second location elsewhere on the map that players have connected to this same general theme. An isolated cabin where an elderly woman can occasionally be found, one whom Arthur, in an unprompted piece of dialogue, describes as either being a witch or at least believing herself to be one. No concrete evidence within the game ever confirms a direct link between this woman and the cauldron hidden away in the grizzlies, and the distance between the two locations makes any connection speculative at best. But the parallel has been enough to fuel persistent community discussion. an ongoing effort to determine whether the game intends these two witchcraft-adjacent discoveries to be read as part of a single unified thread or simply as two separate, unrelated nods toward the same broader folk tradition. The timing of it all deserves a moment of real consideration rather than passing mention. The infamous Salem witch trials, which saw more than a dozen people executed in colonial Massachusetts on accusations of witchcraft, concluded in the final years of the 17th century, roughly 2 centuries before the events depicted in Red Dead Redemption 2 take place. 200 years is a long time by most measures, long enough that a game could easily treat the entire subject as ancient history, with no bearing on its own frontier setting. And yet folk belief rarely disappears on the same timeline as formal legal persecution. Rural communities across America carried whispered suspicions about cunning women, healers, and herbalists well into the 20th century. Informal accusations that never rose to the level of trials or executions, but shaped how isolated women living alone were treated by their neighbors regardless. Someone practicing whatever craft this cauldron represents, choosing to live this far from any town, this deep into unforgiving mountain terrain, would have been making a calculated choice grounded in exactly that lingering cultural memory, trading the comforts of settled life for a kind of safety that only total isolation could offer. It's worth considering, too, just how appropriate the game's chosen time period makes this particular mystery feel. Red Dead Redemption 2 is set in 1899, a little more than 2 centuries removed from the Salem witch trials that so deeply shaped early American attitudes toward the supernatural and toward women who lived outside the boundaries society expected of them. By the time this story takes place, formal witch trials are long over, but the deeper cultural suspicion, the folk beliefs, and half-remembered fears that produced those trials in the first place would still have lingered in isolated rural communities scattered across a country this large and this unevenly settled. A woman, or a group of practitioners, choosing to build a life deep in the remote hills of Amberino, far from any town, any church, any neighbor likely to report unusual activity to the authorities, fits comfortably within that historical undercurrent. This far out, at the edge of the map, in country too rugged and too cold for most homesteaders to bother settling, someone practicing whatever craft this cauldron represents would have found exactly the kind of isolation such a life might require. There is one more small detail that separates this encounter from nearly every other supernatural thread scattered across the map. And it's easy to overlook precisely because it seems, on its surface, like the least threatening thing about the entire location. The liquid helps you. Every other unexplained mystery on this list carries at least some implication of danger, cost, or consequence. The night folk want you dead. The Aberdeens want you robbed and buried. The vampire wants a 6th victim. Even Agnes Dowd's presence carries an undercurrent of grief and violence baked into her very origin. The cauldron, by contrast, offers nothing but restoration, asking nothing in return beyond a moment of your attention and whatever risk you are willing to take by drinking an unidentified liquid found bubbling in an abandoned hut deep in the wilderness. That inversion, danger dressed up as kindness rather than kindness concealing danger, might be the strangest choice of all, and it leaves players with perhaps the most unanswerable question in this entire list. Why would anything hidden this deep in these hills, surrounded by bones and candlelight, and a raven trained to announce every trespasser, want to help a stranger at all? The game never resolves any of it. Whoever tends this hut, whoever keeps the candles burning and the liquid simmering, remains entirely unseen, present only through the evidence they've left behind, and the raven that watches every visitor with obvious, deliberate suspicion. Drink from the cauldron, feel your body restored by something you can't identify and were never given the chance to ask about, and walk back out into the cold Amberino hills carrying nothing but questions. Somewhere in these woods, something or someone is still brewing, patient, unseen, waiting for the next traveler curious enough or desperate enough to wander off the path and find their way to a fire that never seems to go out.